Professor Moyo, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. I would like to begin with the agrarian situation, particularly the land situation which you see in the world. As you know very well, we have written about it very extensively. We have a situation in certain parts of Africa where you have settler colonialism, where there are gross inequalities relating to land. And this is of course also true in many parts of Latin America, the so-called latifundia situation and so on. Given this very diverse situation in many developing countries, what kind of approach would you recommend in terms of looking at the question of land ownership, land operations, and in terms of, there were a number of attempts to try to move forward with agrarian reforms in the past, as you know. But what kind, are there any general approaches, and what would be, if not, would there be specific approaches for different situations?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think to begin with, if we look at the continent historically, we can think about the land situation and the penetration of capital, transformation of agriculture, in three zones, more or less, three modes. You have the settler colonial parts of Africa, predominantly in Southern Africa, as well as Kenya, and in North Africa, Algeria, Egypt, and so where you had the alienation of land, foreign and large capital, creating big estates, mostly of a settler type, settlement, family, large-scale family farms, capitalist farms, reliant on cheap labor from dispossessed in the labor reserve. So, for instance, if you look at South Africa and Zimbabwe and Namibia, which were the core settler countries, they relied from labor from alienated within those countries, but also within the region. Malawi, Zambia, Botswana, Lesotho, all became labor reserves that supplied the core. And so the agrarian relations were hinged around land alienation, cheap labor supply, and labor policies that compelled the supply of cheap labor. So that's we can call that the settler zone. And by and large, about 8 or so countries on the continent, as I've mentioned. And then you have the policy that emerged in West Africa and parts of East Africa, more or less what we can call is a merchant, dominated by merchant capitalist penetration of agriculture through private trading houses, transnational trading houses, which also operated in Asia and Latin America and so forth, but which extracted surpluses from the peasantry through monopolistic, even monopolistic marketing arrangements protected by the state and channeled mainly to the colonial markets, supplying the colonial market. Very exploitative relationships, but which nonetheless led to a differentiated development of the peasantry, the small family farmers proper, but differentiated with say 5-10% of those populations of farmers becoming richer farmers or bigger small-scale family farmers. And this is where you had the exports, the cocoa, coffee, coming from that, and labor supplies from the northern part of the Sahel. So the relationship became more or less of informal labor relations, land labor relations with tenancies from laborers in the north, and a concentration, a differentiation that created a thin layer of highly commercial richer peasant farms. So that was the second most dominant. The third is what Samir Amin is proposed, this three-way formulation. The third is what we call the concession, Africa of the concessions, and this is in the Congo, the Congos, Cameroon, Central African Republic. These Well, a combination of mining, concessions, and agricultural estates that by and large didn't promote settler capitalism, didn't promote organized peasant agriculture, promoted a few estates, plantations, extracted timber with cheap labor, forced labor. So you had that tradition of an estate agriculture with a peripheral peasant agriculture that was not integrated into the global markets substantially, but provided labor to these estates. So this historically has been the channel. In the golden years after the Second World War, well, after the 60s, the growth path that we talk about until 75, there was an attempt by most of the independent states to promote transformation of agriculture, including through creating some selective capitalist state farms, private farms on a small scale, while modernizing the peasantry. In all these countries, including in countries like Zimbabwe after independence, which tried to include the peasantry, promote its development, but basically with limited subsidies, which did see a certain growth for at least 15 or so years after independence. Following this period in the 80s, as you know, there was stagnation and a declining rate of production of mainly foods, and the terms of trade, as we know, everything has been went down the hill. Although there has been substantial growth, part of it determined by demographic growth of the small farmers, family farms, expanding on a base of extensive production. So you have this very extensive family farming with low yields and so forth, growth in absolute terms, but in relative terms not sufficient supplies of food, and yields very low and so forth. The incomes also low. So you have that. In that situation, we have what we see today in the last 10, 15 years, following a few years of liberalization, the neoliberal era in the late 90s. Many of the African countries began to liberalize their land policies, land tenure policies, and more or less on the assumption that we're creating some kind of market conditions for easy leasing of land to investors would promote growth, and also again encouraging export, new so-called new exports. Now, so we did see that during the 90s there was a very limited wave of expansion of indigenous capitalist farmers on a very small scale, that its significance was quite limited, although it did play a role in the new exports, pineapples and so forth in West Africa, the food supplies, with the peasant also increasing supplying basic foods, the starch, maize, cassava and all these beans, but without a qualitative growth in the output of food. And so going through the 90s, we more or less had a situation where there was a small encroachment into the customary lands, very small scale, in Africa of the peasant economies, Africa of the concessions, where you begin to get a peasantry emerging post-independence, and an attempt to create a middle farmer, capitalist farmer from indigenous, on a very small scale. Now things have appeared to be changing dramatically over the last 10 or so years, since 2001 to as the food crisis, the energy crisis begin to emerge, you have a new external demand for concessioning land on the continent. And this is fairly significant in the sense that what we are seeing is a convergence of these different modes. The creation of new plantations and estates which are vertically integrated into world markets, so, for biofuel or old exports, new exports, commodities. And you have an indigenous capitalist farming slowly emerging, but still not as extensively established as settler capitalism in South Africa, for instance. But you do have a convergence of these three modes. Meanwhile, in South Africa, and countries like Zimbabwe through the 90s, you were getting more land concentration, Namibia, and you were getting the expansion of transnational corporations in sugar, tea, and so forth, and then spreading their wings into Mozambique, Zambia, the DRC, the Congo, into Nigeria, and from the mid-late 2000s, you have European capital and some Asian capital beginning to secure land. Contrary to the common belief that the Chinese are buying up most of the land in Africa or the Indians, is basically 55–60% of these new acquisitions are from Western Europe and the US, into Sudan, into Ethiopia, and so forth. And so you do have, from some of the more or less semi-peripheral countries, well, UK, including China, India, Gulf countries, they take a second place. About 30 or so % of the land that is being bought in estates comes spread across those. And domestic capital from within. So, for example, Kenyan capital buying into Uganda, Egyptian capital into Sudan, Nigeria and Ghana, and so forth. So you have a new dynamic of land acquisition, so which suggests a movement, to a convergence to what I am trying to call a trimodal agrarian structure. That is what we can see: peasant, middle farm, capitalist farm, more or less family farm. Many of these family farms are companies, but still mainly owned by family units, and then corporate estates, which are transnational with a few local companies. So the scenario is this negotiation of the African governments in basically about 15 countries out of the 54, 56, if we like, with South Sudan and Sahrawi. In these 15 countries, there is a significant entry of estate, corporate farming on a large estate basis. So Sudan, Ethiopia, Mozambique, DRC, Angola a little bit, Mozambique I've mentioned, Tanzania, Zambia, about 8 or so, and then you've got a little it's happening in Nigeria and Mali, a bit in Senegal. So about 10 to 15 countries where you have the standards there. And very interestingly is that you also have about 6, 7, 8 countries, European countries, British, Americans, about 8 or so countries which are dominant in the buying of leasing of land. Yeah. And this is significant. The figures vary. The data is not so good. We're talking about between 20 million hectares at the lower scale of 20 million arable hectares, up to 50 million arable hectares. Now, 20 million of arable land is a lot of land, because a big part of African land is desert. It's not necessarily arable, and the development of arable land is quite a huge investment. The extension of it is quite something that takes a while. So it is a significant development, but does not wipe out or displace the peasantry. It selectively displaces contesting lands, which higher potential lands, and certain zones which have greater mineral water resources. So you have a kind of a concentration of land, high quality land, while maintaining what I would call this trimodal evolving thing. So
let me ask,
yeah.
this situation, which is quite diverse in Africa, let alone going to other parts of the world, does it still make sense to talk about a single agrarian reform agenda for the purposes of development and equity? Or do we need to be very concrete in terms of developing an appropriate agenda going forward?
Yes. Yeah, so I think that as you can say, we in a number of the countries you have different proportions of this trimodal accumulation trajectory, and there is certainly the bimodal model, the idea of a bimodal strategy, I think is, or if you like, a trimodal, but more or less peasant and small capitalists. That's well entrenched in most minds of the African leadership and in society. The idea that you can have a coexistence. So I don't think that you can talk simply of a peasant family farm or just a capitalist. There's sort of complementarities and so forth. The issue is that these compete for the land. So how to regulate the balance of access to the basic land resources and water resources, and how to get a more effective, efficient use of these resources, because there's so the land policies that promote effective use. For instance, land taxes may be appropriate in areas where you have speculative holding by indigenous populations of larger tracts of good land, or even in those cases where you have these plantation or corporate capital, you would require taxes if the extent is not so substantial as to warrant redistribution. In other words, there are places where this plantation agriculture is significant, but not substantial enough as to warrant a breaking up. Yeah. But there are situations where the establishment of plantation agriculture, for example, in this new round, in certain regions in Tanzania, certain parts in Ethiopia, where this has clearly displaced large segments of the peasant population with no alternative. There is no case for that kind of displacement. I think that looking at it from a political economy point of view, in terms of the class forces, the balance of forces, what you can think about is a kind of a compact that is being made. In fact, what I think is happening, and we will not talk too much about Zimbabwe, but even in the land reform in Zimbabwe, one of the things that you can get out of it, seeing that it comes late decolonization, but it combines a different range of policy aspirations and social aspirations. It's a kind of a compact of saying that we redistribute this land as monopolized by the few settler, white capital and corporate. Keep some agro-industrial estates because they have an industrial function, high employment, like some of the sugar estates and ethanol producing that already exist, with some of the state funds. Redistribute underutilized land held by large white farmers, but redistribute that to enable a broader access to peasant farms and a new kind of small, medium-scale capitalist farm. That's the compact, insofar as the industrial trajectory is not able to absorb those large numbers of people out. So you're still looking for, in the next 15 or 20 years, a transition in which this type of interplay. I think that is what we can do. We can talk about more or less a pure radical redistributive agenda, but I don't think that in terms of the real political economy, that is what will.
One final question. How meaningful is it to talk about family farmers and coalition of family farmers? Or do we need to differentiate among family farmers, and how do we differentiate among family farmers in a way which is useful in terms of public policies to promote agricultural development as well as to address inequalities?
Yeah. So the generic notion of family farms is not very useful but the notion of family farms, in which the bulk, the labor relations, the property, the bulk of the labor that operates on the farms comes from the family itself, with a little bit of hired labor. In other words, they own or have access to land, and the farm depends largely on the family labor. And also a big part of the consumption is meant for the family, which itself has its own merits in terms of consumption. If we use that definition, that takes out a whole range of so-called family farms, which are actually large-scale, like the South African farms, capitalist farms, which depend on hiring cheap labor and a highly mechanized high energy consuming. So in other words, there are these different regimes. Now, if we're talking about unionism of the mobilized organization of the farmers, the policy requirements, because my assumption is that the whole trajectory to make it work in the optimal sense requires extensive state intervention, not only in agriculture, but in relation to some industrial support on the input side, protection, right? And promoting the agro-processing. So in this way, the policy requirements of the real family farms, as opposed to the capitalist farms, they are very different. And so we have to look at the organizations of the family farms proper, which are also differentiated, some more successful than others, with more access to resources, knowledge and savings to increase the productivity. Whereas we have the large-scale farms, the type that, for instance, SACAO, Southern African Commercial Association of Farmers, right? Now, this is a grouping of farms that, on the one hand, defends the holding on to large pieces of land. Now, and this needs clarification, because if you take South Africa, only 20% of the land, 8% of the land, or 10 if you like, with just less than 20% of the farmers, the large-scale commercial farmers, produce 80% of the whole product, export and domestic. So, in actual fact, they're holding 87% of the country's land and producing on less than 20% of it. Right? So there's a lot of underutilization. So this protects this real estate, which is also being diversified into tourism, wildlife, and all sorts of ecological sort of. So their interest, and they look for some protection, but in fact they are well integrated into agribusiness, that in fact they are pursuing a neoliberal policy framework. They want an openness to be able to more or less get further integrated into agribusiness. Now that is a different agenda from this more. So the problem with this family farms is that they have been the least mobilized and organized in terms of, again, if you look at the history of family farm organization anywhere in the world, it always depended on state support as well, through some form of levies and taxes which transferred and supported the creation of corporations, cooperatives, or marketing facilities. And so the agenda of promoting family farm movements, proper family farm movement, is very much a requirement. It's something that also needs to be better integrated into the science and technology development, the universities, to improve and valorize the local knowledge, improve productivity, and so forth. So I think that there is a huge task there, but shouldn't be just idealized and generalized. And so.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Yeah.